A precious, mouldering pleasure it is to meet an antique book, in just the dress his century wore, a privilege, I think, his venerable hand to take, and warming in our own, a passage back or two to make, to times when he was young, his quaint opinions to inspect, and knowledge to unfold, on what concerns our mutual minds, the literature of old. What interested scholars most, what competitions ran, when Plato was a certainty and Sophocles a man, when Sophos was a living girl and Beatrice wore the gown Dante defied, fact centuries before. He traverses familiar, as one should come to town, and tell you your dreams were true. He lived where dreams were born. His presence is enchantment. You beg him not to go. Old volumes shake their vellum hearts, and tantalize just so. That was a poem by Emily Dickinson, and seeing we're standing right here in front of her house, or thought it would be a good idea to stop in and have a look and read. And she's one of my favorite poets. And as I just did the BookTube Newbie quiz yesterday, stopping in here seemed like a good idea. And I look at the times she lived in, because she was born in 1830 and died in 1886. And she lived through the Civil War. And just the turbulent times she lived in kind of shows us and you really can't get more divided than having a civil war. And you look at the political divide that we have today, and people say, oh, we're going to have another civil war like in 1860, and I just look at like her experience with it, and I just feel like, yeah, that could happen, but I don't think it's going to. And I just feel like the issues we have today are trivial in comparison to the issues of the 1850s, because back then you still had slavery, and Emily Dickinson's father was a senator for Massachusetts during the 1850s, if I recall correctly. And so it wasn't like she was totally removed from politics and the happenings of her day. She was right there in the middle of it. You can't get much closer to the politics leading up to the Civil War than having a family member, an immediate family member, who was a senator from Massachusetts. And her father was part of the Democratic Whig Party, as I recall, which was the predecessor to the modern-day Republican Party. And there's in the period during the Civil War was one of her most prolific writing periods. And when you think about why her poems so fixate on death, that might be part of it. And then the house she grew up in was actually up the street, and they moved back here because this was the old family house that Emily Dickinson's grandfather built. And when it went up for sale, her father scooped it up, and they left the house that was in front of the cemetery. So that growing up looking down into a cemetery might have also played into her being a morbid poet. I don't think it's really fair to call Emily Dickinson a morbid poet, because so many of her poems are very life-affirming. Like, that it will never come again is what makes life so sweet. Believing what we do not believe does not exhilarate. That if it be at best in a blade of estate. and this instigates an appetite precisely opposite. I look at poems like that, and it's it gets at how precious life is and how we only get one life to live, and we really got to do what our hearts dictate, because we're not really going to be happy otherwise. And I guess freedom to do so really cuts at the heart of the matter. In the 19th century, like, women couldn't vote. Emily Dickinson could not vote. She was a woman before the 19th Amendment. And her father was a politician. So she might have had political aspirations, but if she did, she couldn't pursue them just because of the times she lived in. And that's maybe one of the real tragedy in history. And we remember her for her poetry, but if she'd been able to do and have the liberty that women today have, I think it's important to ask what course her life would have taken. And we know she never married. She thought about marrying a man later in life, Judge Otis Phillips, one of her father's friends. And he passed away before she could give a definitive yes or no on the topic. He passed away. And we know she had, we believe she had a really intense lover early in her life because of the master letters. All right, so the master letters were written to an unknown recipient. We just have 3 of them, I believe. And most of Emily Dickinson's correspondence was burnt by her sister upon her death. And so we just have the poems, as no instructions was left in Emily Dickinson's will as to what was to be done with them. So we lost a lot of the correspondence, and most of the letters that we do have were ones she mailed to other people. And her copies, her sister burned them. And so that is part of what perpetuates the myth of Emily Dickinson, is that we don't know a lot about her, her private life, and maybe nor should we, because we live in a day where we want to know every intimate detail about someone's life, every thought they had, and in the end, she was probably as flawed as all of us are. And yeah, she could write great poetry, but she was a very reticent person, allegedly, later in life. But when she was young, she was said to be a very outgoing person. And maybe it was that she had a love interest go south early in life, because there was one instance where her father thought a guy she was interested in just didn't have good enough prospects for her. So there's that too. And like, her opinion on marriage, it doesn't seem like she had a very favorable opinion of the institution, because one poem was, "I'm wife, I've finished that. I'm czar, I'm woman now. It feels safer so. How odd a girl's life looks behind the soft eclipse. This being comfort, but then this other kind was pain. But why compare? I'm wife's." Stop there. I don't know if I remember that poem right, but in that poem, she's talking about being a wife as being like being comfort, and having like your life eclipsed by masculine energy or and that kind of thing. And so like we talk about like mansplaining and all that today, and that's kind of what she's getting at there, is like the whole inequality thing between men and women. And I think it's really important that we strive for equality, and that in relationships both parties are able to pursue their dreams and their own interests and do so in mutually beneficial ways. And that's true in homosexual relationships as it is in heterosexual. And I think if you realize that love is love, it doesn't matter who's in it, and so in the relationship, and two consenting adults, right? And like, we don't know if Emily Dickinson was interested in her sister-in-law Susan Gilbert, who married her brother Austin, whose house is there. And that's actually an interesting story, because her brother and Susan Gilbert wanted to move out west, and then they never did, because her father just basically said, okay, I'll build you a really nice house next to mine. And he squashed the couple's interest in going out west, or their desire to do so. And I kind of have to wonder what would have happened between them if they had gone out west, because her brother ended up philandering with another woman called Mabel Loomis Todd. And that there is like, you have to wonder if her brother was in the relationship for Emily, or like what the thought process was behind Susan Gilbert marrying her brother. Because, like, yeah, she was really close friends with Emily and certainly would have known her brother, but it just feels like back then Amherst was a small town, and so it's not like there was a lot of people to really choose from. And when you look at like the rigid rules of relationships back then, like, you gotta wonder if like I don't think a lot of people were really happy back then in their marriages and their relationships. I just got that feeling that people did it out of a survival instinct. I don't know. That's my 2 cents on the matter. And if Emily had married, she might not have been able to write all the poetry that she did, because like, that just would have been such a cap on her creative energy. And when you look at it, think about relationships and that, like, you've got to be able to do your thing in the context of it. And I look at Dickinson's work, and it really just highlights how important it is to live a wholesome life. And a lot of her relationships were through letters and written writing, and in that way she could really control the meter of the relationship. And we only have a fraction of the total letters that she wrote. And I look at letter writing, and it really is a good way to get to know people. Because, like me, I tend to be really scatterbrained, if you can't tell with how this video has been edited so far. And I have a hard time holding a thought, speaking out loud for a long period of time, but in letters, it's a lot easier to really get to the essence of what you're trying to say. And you can edit and get things exactly as you want them. And today, it often feels like we want things now, on the spot, and that time for editing and revision just isn't there. And one thing Emily Dickinson did in her poetry when she was editing it was she would put alternate word choices off at the side of the page and then where to insert them in the poem. And so by the time she's written one poem with all the alternate word choices in that, it might actually be like 20 poems if you tried each combination with it, because sometimes it would just totally change the meaning. Like you could replace joy with despair and still have the poem work. All right. Now, hit that subscribe button, and everything I've said here today is just a thought, and I reserve the right to change my mind, and that's one thing that I really think we could learn from poetry, and just how Emily Dickinson edited her poetry, is that people can change. And just because we said something really, we got something wrong a couple of years ago or however long ago, it shouldn't haunt us for the rest of our lives. And it's important to remember our mistakes so we don't repeat them.